The preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
I'm glad to inform you that what you see in front of you on the sign is not true, but occupancy by more than 150 is safe and desirable. I would also like to call to your attention that questions will be asked by means of written out cards, which you will please send up after Mr. Samuel and I have spoken. I'm very glad to have the opportunity of speaking on the same platform with Mr. Samuel. This is the first time I've had the privilege of doing so. I've heard him speak solo, and he may have heard me sometimes speak solo, but in a duet, we have so far not appeared. This duet, let me tell you, will not be in the nature of a debate, which may have been the reason for some of you having come here. We always like to hear or see a fight. There will not be any such fight. We are here tonight rather in the capacity of witnesses and not debaters. We are both here to testify to the truth of the same proposition. The proposition, namely, that as Jews we cannot do without our Jewish heritage. On the other hand, we cannot do with it in the form in which it has come down to us. Therefore, we must do something about it in order to be able to utilize it in such a way as to derive from it all that we can for our happiness and for our full self-realization. You know, I assume the law in the Torah, al pi shnayim edim yakum davar, that it takes two witnesses to testify to any matter upon which a legal decision is to be rendered. This is not a matter of a legal decision, but it is a matter upon which each of you has to form his own decision with regard to the way you are to feel about your being Jews. And I assume that hearing two witnesses to the same truth, that truth will sound more plausible. That does not imply that what we say will be above question or doubt. On the contrary, we welcome any questions or doubts that what we shall have said may raise in your minds, and we'll be glad to entertain those questions and try to answer them. American Jews may be divided into four groups from the standpoint of the way they feel about being Jews. About 50%, I dare say, you may think it is an exaggeration, but I believe that as much as 50% of American Jews don't give a continental about the entire problem, whether or not Jewish life is worthwhile. They simply don't think about Jewish life any more than they think about any other kind of life. They just live. I don't imply that we should write them off, but at the present we cannot expect to deal with them or to have them interested in any suggestion that we might offer them. On the other hand, about 10%, these are rough estimates based more on impression than on statistics, but nevertheless, I've been enough with Jewish life to form what I believe to be a correct impression. And my impression is that there are about 10% of our people who definitely believe that Jews are to blame for not allowing themselves to be absorbed by the rest of the population. That is, the out-and-out assimilationists who regret the fact that we Jews take such a long time disappearing from the scene. Their attitude is like that of Charles II, who took a long time dying. When he was surrounded by his courtiers and they were standing around and he saw that they were being bored, he said to them, "Gentlemen, please forgive me for taking such a long time to die." That is the way about how a number of our people feel with regard to their remaining Jews when they should have long ago disappeared from the scene as Jews. About 20% of our people are subject to inner conflict, like Old Man River, who was tired of living and afeared of dying. That is to say, they don't know what it means to be a Jew, and at the same time, they do not like the idea of detaching themselves completely from Jewish life. So that in the final reckoning, only about 10% may be described as constituting the militant minority who are eager to make the most of their being Jews. They would come under the category described, or rather implied, in the statement of the psalmist, who said, "Lo amut ki ahyeh," I will not die but live. I insist upon living as a Jew. I want to live as a Jew. They would like to know how, however. They want a blueprint. They want to be Jews, but they do not know how they can achieve their purpose. I assume that your presence here is evidence of the fact that you belong to the last 10% that I have described. Otherwise, you wouldn't have come. You knew that the discussion would deal with Jewish life, and your presence here is evidence of your interest in it. To be an authentic Jew means three things. First, it means to belong to the Jewish people in the same way as a leaf or a twig of a tree belongs to a live tree. Just as the leaf or the twig feels the sap of the tree coursing through its own veins and feels itself to be an integral part of the tree, of its roots and branches. If it were able to speak, it would certainly deplore the possibility of its being detached from the tree, so organically related does it feel to the tree. And to be a Jew means feeling that way toward the Jewish people, having that sense of belonging, which would cause one to feel unhappy were he to be compelled to live apart from Jewish life, to be separated from them, to be compelled to give up his attachment to them. Secondly, it means To be an authentic Jew means to believe. Not only to belong, but also to believe. To believe what? To believe that the Jewish tradition possesses something which can help us become fully human. In other words, it is not enough to feel that you are an integral part of the Jewish people, but you must be convinced that the Jewish people possesses that heritage, that tradition, by virtue of which it is possible to fulfill oneself as a human being more effectively than it would be without it, particularly for a Jew. And thirdly, to be an authentic Jew means to enjoy the three things: to belong, to believe, to enjoy. To enjoy what? To enjoy living and sharing Jewish folk life. To feel that one gets out of Jewish life not merely memories and not merely ideals. These are very fine things and very inspiring, but after all, one is a human being, and as a Jew, he wants to derive from Jewish life something that actually gives him enjoyment. God knows there's enough reason in the world to feel sad and gloomy. In being a Jew, at least we ought to want to feel that it yields us, besides all these stories of horrors and massacres, that it yields us something that can make us happy, that can entertain us and give us deep enjoyment. Now, what is the situation of the present time? The situation is such as to create a problem. These three requirements for being an authentic Jew cannot be met satisfactorily. Why? We cannot fulfill the requirement of belonging because the Jewish people, or world Jewry today, is unfortunately more like a deracinated, rotting tree than it is like a live tree. Therefore, every individual Jew feels himself to be less like a leaf of a live tree, like a twig of a live tree, and more like a mushroom that grows on decaying wood or a decaying tree. The Jewish people today, outside, of course, of that section of it which is in Israel and which is undergoing a great resurrection, outside the Jews in Israel, the Jews in the rest of the world feel as though they were part of a disintegrating entity. Therefore, they are in no position to satisfy this urgent need to belong. Secondly, from the standpoint of our heritage, of our tradition, unfortunately, the Jewish tradition in the form in which it has come down to us has as yet received no acceptable version to which most modern-minded men and women can subscribe. It raises questions, it raises difficulties, this tradition of ours. And it does not answer the many questions which challenge us, especially those of us who become imbued with the best in modern thought, in Western civilization, somehow feel that this tradition is dated, or it is out of date. It does not speak our language. Therefore, we cannot satisfy the second requirement of believing. And as far as the third requirement of enjoying Jewish life, unfortunately, Jewish life does not exist. Folk life, I mean. Because American Jewish life has not evolved Jewish folk creations or Jewish folk values. Now, Reconstructionism is a movement on the American scene today which proposes a 3R program for Jewish life. To meet these three conditions which prevent a Jew, an American Jew, from feeling that he is an authentic Jew, and from being happy in being a Jew and accepting his Jewishness with inner satisfaction. Reconstructionism proposes the following 3R program. Reconstitute the Jewish people, it says, in the first place. Revitalize the Jewish heritage or tradition and replenish the Jewish cultural folk values. Now, in the discussion this evening, I shall take up the first two parts of this program. Mr. Samuel will deal with the third part of the program, with a replenishment of Jewish cultural folk values. In the same way as I am summing up to a large extent what I had occasion to express in the course of the 3 lectures that I gave, I assume that he will likewise summarize what he said in his 3 lectures, and will add whatever he finds necessary in the light of the discussion tonight. Now, what do I mean by advising the reconstitution of the Jewish people? As I indicated, we have lost that organic character, that is, those Jews who are outside Israel have begun to disintegrate to such an extent that they resemble more an uprooted tree that is rotting and disintegrating than a live tree that has its roots in the earth. Literally, in literal terms, what is the situation of Jews today in this country? To some extent, we are in the same positions as the American nation was after the Revolutionary War. They had fought the war. The 13 states then went each its own way. They realized that they cannot continue in that way, but that they have to come together and unite. In their case, it was a matter of uniting for the first time. In our case, and that makes it a more difficult problem, it is a matter of reuniting ourselves. Our problem is a more complicated one, and I will not enter into the details which make it so much more difficult than the problem which the 13 states had to face after the Revolutionary War, before they became a United States on the basis of a constitution. But although it is a complicated problem, it is not insoluble by any means. What should we Jews do? What must we do in order that the sense of organic unity be recovered? which is that sense which is so essential to each individual Jew. Without it, it is impossible to develop a fruitful, creative program of Jewish education. It is impossible to bring up children to be Jews, to be happy in their Jewishness, because the purpose of education is fundamentally that of integrating the individual into some community, into some larger group. So long as Jews were an organic group, the child knew what he was to be educated for when he was educated as a Jew. Today, the child simply goes through the motions of learning for the sake of his parents without really knowing why. When he begins to think, when he is mature enough to ask himself what the value of it all is, he really is at a loss to answer it. And that is the reason so many of our adolescents leave us immediately after the bar mitzvah or the confirmation exercises. What must we do to overcome this situation? I believe that it is essential for us to have the Jews of the different lands in the world outside Israel, through their representatives, to form, together with the Jews in Israel, to form themselves into a people once again. The representatives of Jews of different lands should convene at Jerusalem with the representatives of Jews in Israel for the following purposes. For the purpose of identifying what it is that binds us into an international corporate body. And secondly, for the purpose of giving that body a name and status and formulating a constitution which will translate that unity into certain responsibilities of the different juries in the various countries of the world. We must, of course, leave it to that convention to define our status as a group, to tell us what we are, what kind of a corporate body are we. We realize that we are not a religious communion. We realize we are not a nation. We realize that we cannot build upon the concept of race. What are we? We need this authoritative body to come and answer that question. And in answering that question, to define the nature of our mutual responsibilities as Jews. That means renewing the historical covenants by which we Jews have hitherto been bound as a people. The fact is that our history abounds in instances of the formation of covenants. When we enter the land, or before we entered the land, in the wilderness, we formed a covenant under Moses, then under Joshua, later under Josiah, after that under Ezra and Nehemiah. The time has come when we must again go through the procedure of renewing our unity by means of a formal covenant, openly arrived at in the presence of all the world. In addition, the Jews of each country, in addition to this covenant, it is necessary for the Jews of each country to build organic communities in each region where that is feasible. What do I mean by an organic community? An organic Jewish community of the kind which does not as yet exist in this country, but which will have to come into being if there is to be a future for Jewish life in this country. An organic Jewish community is one in which priority is given to those activities which foster education, culture, and religion. An organic Jewish community is one in which all the other activities such as those of fraternal orders, social services, overseas relief, and defense organizations, are deliberately geared to the perpetuation and growth of Jewish life. Not merely ends in themselves, not merely fraternal orders for the sake of fraternity and social service for the sake of philanthropy, like overseas relief for the sake of helping others, and defense organization merely for the purpose of fighting anti-Semitism. But all of them, underlying their specific purposes, must have the dominant aim of helping to perpetuate and Jewish life and enabling it to grow. At the present time, our vast resources and energies are poured not into the process of living as Jews, but into the process of escaping or defeating the sinister consequences of our having been born Jews, either by fighting anti-Semitism or relieving the misery and poverty of its victims. So far, in mere outline form, the reconstitution of the Jewish people. Now a word about the revitalization of the tradition. In suggesting that we revitalize, put new life into our tradition, again, I'm not suggesting something that is without precedent in our history. As a matter of fact, this is the third time that our tradition has had to be revitalized on a large scale, reworked, reinterpreted, made to mean something radically different from what it meant originally. The first time that it had to be reinterpreted was when it was challenged by the dominant civilization of Persia, a civilization which stressed the life of the individual in the hereafter and emphasized the idea of human self-fulfillment as possible not in this world but in a world to come. Then our entire tradition was reinterpreted to mean that our future is to be achieved not on this earth but in the Olam Haba. Let me give you a concrete instance. There is the statement in the Ten Commandments, honor thy father and thy mother, in order that thy days may be long upon the earth. Then there is another commandment elsewhere in the Torah which says, when you find a nest, send away the mother bird, and then you can take the young. And in that way, your days on earth will be prolonged. Then the Talmud tells us of a story of a father who sends his child up a roof where there was a nest, and he carried out the orders to send away the mother bird, and as he was going down, the ladder broke and he was killed. And the Talmud says, now look, the Torah promises length of days just for these two commandments. They're the only ones. And look what happened. This poor lad obeyed his father and fulfilled the mitzvah of sending away the mother bird, and when he went down, he was killed. The answer, the Talmud says, oh, you're mistaken. When it says that thy days be many upon the earth, in the land, that's not this land. That's the hereafter. That's a world to come. And in that spirit, the entire tradition is reinterpreted. That was the first time. Then a second time, it had to be reinterpreted in the Middle Ages, when it was challenged by the intellectual atmosphere of the time, by the philosophic thinking of the time, which stressed the fact that God must be dissociated from any qualities or traits that are characteristically human. And on the other hand, there we have in the Bible, God is spoken of all the time as having human traits, as getting angry, as being pleased. And on the other hand, you have actual physical characteristics ascribed to God. All that had to be reinterpreted. That was the second time. Now, a third time has come when our tradition is being challenged. What has to be done with it? It has to be reinterpreted for those who cannot accept its supernaturalism as historical. The tradition, as it has come down to us, is based upon the assumption that God intervenes in the order of nature and performs miracles. And that is the way he has manifested himself unto our ancestors. The students of history, the students of the Bible text, of course, cannot accept that as literal fact. And so the very basis, the very foundation is undermined, the very foundation of our tradition as it has come down to us. What is to be made of that tradition? It has to be so reinterpreted as to make it possible for those who cannot subscribe to the supernatural. We have among us supernaturalists, we have among us humanists. Shall we rule out any one group that does not subscribe to what some people would regard as an authoritative rendering or an authoritative version of the tradition? That is no longer possible. We must recognize the fact that the time has come, if Jewish life is to continue and to grow, the time has come when we must accept religious pluralism, when we must recognize the place of diversity in Jewish unity. Now that is without precedent. That is something which our ancestors did not have to grapple with. That is our problem. And it is in that way that our tradition must be reinterpreted to make it possible for people to satisfy their hunger for the eternal, for people to satisfy their passionate indignation against injustice, for people to find in our tradition that which would satisfy their love, that deep human love which is a yearning to be a means of eliciting the best in others. To make that possible is now the task of our spiritual leaders, of our writers, our thinkers, our rabbis, our seminaries. The Jewish tradition must be reinterpreted in order that it be revitalized. Now we come to the third point. The Jewish folkway, Jewish folk life must be made enjoyable. It must be rich in content, but must be made creative. And I know of no one who can tell you how that can be done than Mr. Samuel.
Kaplan finishes up with a compliment which puts you on the spot and promises that you'll deliver some kind of a talk which is entirely beyond your capacity. In other words, puts your name on a promissory note which you are incapable of paying. I am not at all capable of providing the information or the methodology that Dr. Kaplan so generously loaded me with a responsibility for. In fact, as you will perceive in the course of my remarks, I am very much at sea in connection with the whole of the task which confronts us, the elements of which Dr. Kaplan has very lucidly exposed to us. One thing is quite clear to me to begin with. There is no such thing as American Judaism. There is in this country a residual Judaism which was brought over from Europe, or residual Judaisms. The Orthodox, even the conservative, which is merely orthodoxy with a large number of concessions and no philosophy, or the Reformed Judaism, which is simply a version of the Germanic adaptation to the modern world, but nothing at all that smacks of the American scene, and which is as redolent of the place of its origin as these regionalist Judaisms were. Those of you, probably 2 or 3 who are present now, who listened to my lectures previously, these hardy veterans and survivors of the previous lectures will remember that I devoted a good deal of space to the description of the regionalist character of European Judaism. By regionalist, I mean that it wasn't simply a Judaism which incorporated, as necessarily it must have done to have been Judaism at all, the permanent ethical values of the Jewish episode in civilization. It was a Judaism which one might almost say reeked of the European scene. It had incorporated a European language and made it its instrument, namely the Germanic, which became the Yiddish. It had taken over melodies and made them Hasidic. It had taken over clothes and made them our religious garb. It had taken over a host of things from the surrounding world and reworked them, circumcised them, made them completely part of the Abrahamic covenant, and it was Jewishness. It was something that the people lived and something which sprang out of a corporate life. Now, to me, the most interesting feature of that Judaism has been that it spoke in unmistakable accents of its origin and of its high ethical and moral purpose, even among the illiterate. Now, I came from a fairly illiterate Jewish environment. There were no scholars in my family. I can't boast of saints. It's with difficulty that I discovered a number of honest men. But certainly there were not in my immediate vicinity, with the exception of a gentleman who's present this evening, strangely enough, also a waif from Manchester, England, whose father represented much piety and learning. But with this exception, I can recall, in the environment to which I was accustomed in my childhood, nothing at all of all those immense saintly values and of those rare and inspiring spiritual possessions that we speak of so proudly as Jews. And yet, in that world of simple people, there ran a thread, a popular thread, of the deepest self-identification with the Jewish purpose. And I found it, as I told those who were present at my previous lectures, in an extraordinary folk resistance to the pagan ritual of competition and of sport. It has become customary among us degenerate Jews, and I use that word in seriousness and in contempt. It has become customary among us degenerate Jews also to join in the poking of fun at our parents and grandparents, who saw nothing but the ridiculous and the debasing in the world's addiction to sport. We find it something, at best, let us say, quaintly forgivable that they are amazed when grown-up people become quite insane at spectacles, either in direct or in indirect participation in the ritual of competition. But what was remarkable about those simple Jews was that quite unaffectedly, and without a conscious and explicit philosophy, they did contain within themselves a repudiation of the principle of competition. Not that they didn't practice competition. Life compelled them to. They competed like everybody else, for money, for position, for security, for social prestige, whatever it might be. But they did not glorify it in a ritual which they elevated to the principal element of the folklore of their world. I say that the principal unifying element of folklore in the Western world is sport, competition, and the combativeness which these both represent and exacerbate. Our simple Yiddish Jewish world, my simple Yiddish Jewish world, with very little, even Chumash and Rashi. There was some of that. Certainly no Talmud. Maybe now and again somebody knew a little bit Ablat Mishnayos. Very little of that. my Yiddish Jewish world had this rich attitude toward the sanctity of the cooperative principle in a measure which leaves me more and more astonished the older I grow and the wider the perspective which I gain upon the scenes of my childhood. Now I want to know, was that an essential element? Was that in fact the essential and identifying element in the Jewishness of the masses? Because independently of the specific instrumentalities of expression, whether there was this kind of a prayer, and there was that kind of information, and there was the other kind of recollection concerning the heroic deeds of so on, all peoples have these. If you go into the history of the English, you'll discover that they too have noble figures, figures of fighters, figures of scholars, figures of saints. They have their music, they have their cooking, they have their architecture, their clothes. So that if we are to accept Jewish folklore, so to speak, as being on a level with the others, then it is one of a number of civilizations and a number of attitudes, or one of a number of subdivisions of civilizations. The point I tried to make in my very brief discourses on Jewish literature and self-expression was that this Jewish world represented a unique civilization which stood over against the civilization of the Western world in a relationship which could not be discovered in any of the fragments of the civilization of the Western world. We Jews were not simply one of the peoples. We were the outstanding people in that respect, and the discomfort which my parents and my uncles and my aunts, these so-called ignorant Jews from Romania, the discomfort which they felt in the presence of the dominant cultural element, the sport element, the discomfort, and let me say, the very self-conscious derision which they permitted themselves. They were not awed by it. They were not overwhelmed, flabbergasted. They didn't feel themselves thrust into a position of humiliation because they didn't know what a goal was or what a strike was. To them it was rubbish. And they dared to say so. And they sustained this view in their lives. I say these people stood over against the Western world in a special relationship. And what I am deeply concerned with, profoundly worried by, is the question of the retention of the ethic, the retention of the attitude which made this the characteristic self-expression of these people. The rest, I won't say it's unimportant. It is as important as the body is to one's life in a sense, and yet the body is not the life, or at least it is not the essence of the life. The body is here for the purpose of enabling us to live. Those customs which they had, the Pesach and the Yom Kippur and whatever they observed, and it wasn't much in my circle of kashrus. The deep feeling, however, which was roused by Yom Kippur and by various other festivals, these were the instruments with which they carried that particular outlook. But they mustn't be confused with that outlook. I am quite certain they might have made other instrumentalities the carriers of that outlook. And what I cannot see yet, what I've been wrestling with for years, is the problem of discovering the instrumentality for the reincorporation of the Jewish ethic in a terminology fitted to the present time. Now, I have frequently said, and I say it with some embarrassment in his presence, Professor Kaplan is, as far as I know, the only Jew who is organically concerned with this question. Everywhere else, we take the tacit attitude that so you'll go to a Talmud Torah, or you'll go to a cheder, you'll learn a bit more, we must improve the methods of tuition, you'll get some connection with Palestine, but it's the old story all over again. It's the same kind of Judaism. Now, it can't be. It cannot be the kind of Judaism that we had before and which expressed itself in a terminology which was relevant to those days. It must be a Judaism which is characterized, I think, by two things. Number one, it must be relevant to the intellectual climate of this time, as Dr. Kaplan correctly pointed out. We just can't use the terminology of the old world in a world which is entirely alien to it. And let me observe that people who talk about keeping the religion of their fathers in this present world are precisely the people who are not keeping the religion of their fathers. Because the moment they say, I'm keeping the religion of their fathers, there's crept into their attitude an element of self-consciousness, of defiance, and of obstinacy, which takes away from the tacitness of the Judaism. Their fathers were Jews, Stamm der Weltverein. They weren't Jews for the purpose of defying the outside world and showing they were as good as their fathers. They were Jews organically. But the moment you begin to imitate your father, you're no longer a Jew. He wasn't imitating anybody. He was the real thing. And therefore, in this pretense, in this self-assertiveness, there is already the evidence of an unnaturalness and decay. It would be the Judaism of our fathers if we found it to be as properly related and as tacitly firm in this present world as they found it in their world. They found it in their world by ignoring the world. The world didn't exist for them. The outside world, of course it existed, it controlled their lives, but it controlled their lives much as the forces of nature controlled their lives. It's something that you simply looked at and said, well, that's what nature does, that's what the Goyim does, it comes to the same thing. There's no arguing either with nature or with Goyim, and you mustn't hold either of them responsible. But as far as their own lives were concerned, this was it. Their lives were normal and tacit. Their lives were so whole to them that they never thought of apologizing to the police. They never thought of engaging ADL people to explain to the outside world, you see how nice the Jew is, if you only understood him. It would have seemed to them fantastic to take up this attitude of relativism to the outside world. But we, in this world, to ignore the outside world as they ignored theirs would be as unnatural as if they had tried to live with their world. Because actually we are in this world. We are as Western as the rest of the world. We have taken over the good and the bad elements of the West to such an extent that if we don't recognize this fact, we shall cripple ourselves completely in the attempt to remain Jewish. We have got the Western world. And the tacit thing for us is to be aware of it, to make allowance for it, and to insist upon the Jewishness. Now I come to this question of insisting on the Jewishness. I've begun to feel, this is now, some years since this has become more and more deeply embedded in my mind, that the folkloristic sense in which we thought of Judaism in the past, a Judaism which people picked up out of their Jewish environment, or at any rate found fortified by their Jewish environment. A Judaism which, like an intelligent and sensitive person listening to a semi-familiar text of a play, they could, so to speak, reconstruct on hints. Such a Judaism is becoming less and less possible. You could have a Bonchishweig growing up a complete Jew. You could have a Rabbi of Nemirov in that story of Peretz's growing up a complete Jew and appreciated by Jews. You could have simple folk people, such as I described to you in my last lecture, completely Jewish. You can't have it nowadays. Try to imagine the equivalent of a pious Balagola in the old days. A Balagola is the taxi driver of the pre-mechanistic age. The present-day equivalent of the Balagola is the taxi driver. Imagine a taxi driver in New York who is folk Jewish. What you're likely to hear from him is something like this: for Christ's sake, I missed Kaddish last week. That would be the folk character, of a Jewish taxi driver. I remember during the debates around the English attitude in Palestine, when we were struggling for independence there, I would talk with anybody, just feeling the public pulse, as it's pompously put in the newspapers, I would talk with anybody about what was going on. If I took a taxi, I would talk with the taxi driver. Say, what do you think was going on in England? What do you think of the English? He says, English, those sons of bitches, he says, what they're doing to us. That was his Zionism. That was the extent of his implication. That was the extent of his implication in the Jewish feeling. Now that is folk today. And you cannot get a folk Judaism corresponding to the folk Judaism that I spoke about in this country. It is impossible, it is an impossible dream to strive in the direction of a mass folk response and texture of that kind. There will have to be instead a very distinctly and almost harshly disciplined acceptance of the modes of Jewish living. Not that the Jew didn't have a harsh discipline in the past, or let me say, not use so unpleasant a word, a severe discipline in the past, or an exhilarating discipline, if you like. Learning was always stressed and emphasized. But there was the possibility in those days of a Hasidic movement rising out of the lowliest levels of Jewish life, conducted in Yiddish, because Hasidism gave us its most glorious episodes in Yiddish and not in Hebrew. By the time it had become Hebraic and scholarly and had produced philosophies and Chabad Hasidism and had produced the dynasties, it was no longer the pure folk thing that it had been at the beginning. But can you imagine a Judaism arising on Toit Street and Toyd Avenue here among the simple Jews? It's not there. We shall never have that again. It is impossible in this present world. And it is also quite likely that in this we are in consonance with the rest of the world, in as much as the folk element everywhere is being subordinated to an internationalism of form and to an internationalism of intellect. When people speak as they do of our revival of a Jewish folk form in Israel, I think they are operating with what is already a vanishing aspect of Western civilization, namely the localisms and the regionalisms which produced very distinctive types. I don't think we shall have that even in Israel. I think we shall not have in Israel something as peculiarly, separately, nostalgically Jewish in its particular forms as the Jewry of Poland or the Jewry of Lithuania. I don't think you're going to find that if you leave a Western country and plunge into Israel, that suddenly you feel yourself to be immersed in another world, as you did when you left the Goyish world and plunged into the ghetto. And if you had a certain sensitivity, perception, sources of information, understanding, then you found in that ghetto world all the gold, the transmitted gold of the most precious of the Jewish spiritual discoveries. But you're not going to find it in that form, I think, in an Israel to which you come from the Western world. Israel will be much more like the Western world than the ghetto was, like the surrounding peoples. If in Israel they do perpetuate, as I hope they will, as I think they will, these Jewish values, it will be on another level, on a highly sophisticated level, a very deliberate level in which the art forms, the forms of expression, the deliberately created choreography, using choreography in its widest sense of life, in which the deliberately created choreography will have been recreated at this time. And here, I think, is where the enormous difficulty of a reinterpretation of our tradition comes. We think of reinterpreting our tradition, but we keep on thinking just the same in what is the traditional form of traditions. What are the traditional forms of traditions? They are the local peculiarities, which very often have been the semi-accidental and semi-artifice results of peculiar local conditions. That which the locality provided was the basis of the artifacts which man created as his local expression of life. Now, as the world becomes unified in its techniques and in its technology, that becomes increasingly difficult. As I travel from country to country, for example, as I go from, my watch stopped. I'm really speaking a hell of a long time. What time is it? I have 10 more minutes? I need just about 55. As I travel from country to country, I observe the astounding uniformity which is cast over the spiritual life of peoples, in a way that people seldom observe. Take, for instance, newspapers. I read an American newspaper here, French newspaper in Paris, an Italian newspaper in Rome, a Hebrew newspaper in Israel. And you'd say, well, they're different languages and they reflect the different countries. It isn't true. And you can, as a matter of fact, get a remarkable confirmation of this by picking up a Yiddish newspaper in this country. Because then you will see that the international jargon of journalese has made all languages similar. The necessity of putting into the heading 1 line, 2 lines, 3 lines, containing most of the content. And then the leading paragraph, which is a recapitulation of the content. And then with the, it is alleged and says, at the end of the paragraph, if you read the English, the French, the German, the Hebrew, and the Italian, you are amazingly aware of a uniformity of language behind this apparent diversity of vocables. And this is far more unifying than the difference in language is dispersing. So that in 1,000 things, whether it be the fact that all people talk in terms of motor cars and TV and radio and programs and radio heroes and movie heroines and the children of movie heroines born out of wedlock, tremendous items in the civilization of the Western world, whether they talk of these things or of 100 other things belonging to the Western world, it is of uniform things that they speak. And their lives are made uniform technologically speaking. The consequence being that if they are to conserve a tradition, it will no longer be in the tradition of ancient traditions. It will be a totally new concept of tradition. It will be a tradition practically without these bodies, without these instrumentalities, without these clothes, these garbs, these bones, these sinews, and something of the intellect, the will, and the ethical consciousness. Now, that is a tremendous program to put up in front of the people. But I believe that there is no such thing as Jewish survival unless you have, to a very large extent, this attitude. I'm not denying that there will be some element of tradition of those forms. We haven't quite done with them, and they will continue with diminishing vigor as I see it for, heaven knows, generations or perhaps centuries. But they will no longer be the dominant element. In this world, it will be the will, the formulation, the trained intellect, the sophisticated understanding, the conscious acceptance of the point of view and of its propagation, which will determine whether we will remain Jewish. I am not at all sure whether it is feasible or even desirable that there should be so many Jews. Our concept that we have to have 5 million Jews in America derives, of course, from the general propaganda of bigger and better, whether it be in organizations or in sales of toothpaste. But I don't see why it is absolutely essential there should be 5 million Jews if 4 million of them don't know anything about Judaism, and apart from the fact that they are a dead weight upon our people, misrepresent us to the outside world. Were there 1 million Jews of that sophisticated and trained class accepting the tradition in the new tradition, I think it would be infinitely more valuable for the world. It is this change that we have to bring about. You cannot bring to a modern world the folkloristic gestures, the folkloristic longings which belong to another time. When children have not been brought up in the ancient sanctity of the Sabbath, if they haven't been patterned in their early years to respond to the charm and grace and fairy-like beauty of the Seder, if they've never been crushed by the awe of Yom Kippur, You just can't give it to them from the outside. Nor can you persuade them to impose it upon their children in as much as they haven't got it themselves. Because as a matter of fact, that would be quackery. It would be the kind of faking which uncultivated parents practice upon their children when they say, now you be cultured. See, I ain't got no time for culture, but I want you to be cultured. And the child looks at the parent and says, what do you want of me? And this sort of thing, when a person, a Jewish person who is not involved in these things, tries to impose upon the child, the person must become involved, and he can only become involved through a deliberate effort of the intellect, through explanation, differentiation, to the extent that he can be at all. And to the extent that he cannot, let us recognize that it is a dead loss. And let us recognize it is better to turn away from these areas in which no effect can be produced, and to concentrate upon those areas where intensity of effort will produce at least a core of heat which can warm a certain limited periphery. Now, I know that this is not the popular kind of thing that would be asked of someone in connection with the Jewish problem. It isn't a gadget, and it isn't the optimistic response that gives you the uplift of mass and of crowds applauding and of vast material changes in the universe. But I think it is in the tradition, in the old sense too, as well as in the tradition, in the new tradition, that we Jews should concentrate upon the spirit at a time when it is becoming increasingly difficult to make the physical the vehicle of our outlook. The folkloristic now has to become the sophisticatedly intelligent. And perhaps we've carried over from the past enough of this regard for the intellectual, and perhaps enough of a semi-instinctual repudiation of the purely playful to be able to carry it out. In any case, I don't see any other program of action, and it is, I think, in a fusion of something that I want and something that Dr. Kaplan and Reconstructionism provide, that we shall find, if not the solution, there aren't always solutions, at least a cogent and appealing program of action.
And I want to thank him also for his emphasis upon an aspect of the program that is very often used as a reason for combating it and denouncing it, namely its intellectualism. The point made by Mr. Samuels is that we cannot expect a future for Jewish life to happen. It must be the result of deliberate effort, and especially high intellectual effort. It will not come spontaneously. It cannot be a folk mass movement. We must be prepared to have it depend upon a sophisticated, knowing, conscious purpose of what we want to achieve. Now that you've heard not both sides, but the full statement of a program for American Jewish life, I should like to receive from you, and so would Mr. Samuels, any questions you want to ask written out on the cards that have been handed to you or can be handed to you if you haven't got them. And please indicate on the cards which one of us you want to answer that question, whether Mr. Samuels or myself. And so we shall be able to proceed in proper order. I don't know why I should have taken upon myself to be the chairman. Mr. Samuel says professorial instinct. Well, but this is a very deliberate one, apparently, under the circumstances, not an instinct.
You'll realize, ladies and gentlemen, that questions which are given here, when they're serious, call for very extensive answers which cannot be given. I can only indicate the headings of answers to questions, for example, like this one. Wherein is the Jew different from other... Oh, no, that's for Professor Kaplan, I'm sorry. That's from other groups, yes. For me is, what are some examples of Jewish borrowings from other groups from the religious standpoint? Well, that should be your question, Professor Kaplan, and mine is, wherein the Jew is different from other groups? It's extremely difficult to give in more, say, in half a dozen sentences, the difference between the Jew and other groups. If I'm compelled to do it, I'll say it's as follows. It is a transmitted difference of outlook on the purpose and the tone of life. It isn't just contained in dogmas, nor even in specific ethical statements. There can be very similar ethical statements by Christianity and some branches of Judaism, by Mohammedanism and some branches of Judaism, enormous similarities, and the finest people of both, of all groups, will look very much alike. But it is in the approach to the meaning of life that you discover what a group means. And for me, to me it seems that the Jewish group has from the beginning implied an earnestness in life and an eschatology, an end view, a final purpose, an end of the days development which the others didn't. No Greek ever saw the end of the world as meaning the coming of universal peace. The Greeks saw instead as the perfect state the Republic of Plato, which was a fighting machine. Nor do you find, as far as I know, in Mohammedanism, that the aim of all religious purpose is to bring about complete peace. It was a fighting religion. Among Jews, it meant this final purpose that our life should be geared to the bringing closer of a time of universal peace among men. That is at least one of the aspects of Jewish differentiation from the rest of the world. What do you feel has Reformed Judaism to offer to the American Jew? It had nothing to offer. Or rather, it had something to offer, but not in connection with being Jewish. It offered a certain weakening of the discomfort which one felt in being Jewish. It offered a feeling of vague and rather sanctimonious unity with the surrounding Christian groups. And it offered an avenue of escape from an ancient Jewish identification. But Reformed Judaism has altered, as many of you know. Reformed Judaism is not the Reformed Judaism. Reformed Judaism today is not the Reformed Judaism of 30, 40 years ago, and certainly not the Reformed Judaism of 100 years ago in Germany. And as a matter of fact, the extreme Reformed Jews who repudiate Zionism and Israel, and there are handfuls of these extraordinary freaks, these people are genuinely the conservators of the Reformed Judaism that was intended 100 years ago. So that actually, I don't know what to say about Reformed Judaism, because it's no longer Reformed Judaism. It is something which has some of the impulses and inclinations of Zionism, of Jewish self-identification, of Jewish orthodoxy, of Judaism generally. It is groping, and it hasn't found anything which really makes it a Reformed Judaism as it originally intended to be. As a matter of fact, I'm very strongly under the impression, and this is certainly confirmed by the attitude of Reconstructionism on this view, that all this business of the differentiation of Jews into Reform and Orthodox and Super-Orthodox is becoming less and less meaningful nowadays. It's becoming less and less meaningful because we're operating in a world in which those concepts didn't have no meaning. I must differ from Dr. Kaplan in the statement which he made. Perhaps I took it too literally, that we haven't known divisions in Judaism. Of course we have. We've had them from the beginning. I won't say the Sadducees and the Pharisees, but among the Pharisees themselves, among Jews who went out into the wilderness to live as hermits, namely the Essenes. We've had the rationalists and the romanticists and the traditionalists in the Middle Ages. We've had the Hasidim and the Misnagdim. We've had among the Hasidim the various shadings of the schools. We have had these variations, but they were not variations as to the degree of Judaism which one wanted to keep. Now, the Judaism of these people was largely posited upon the notion that adaptation to the outside world meant a modification of one's Judaism, not from the point of view of the inherent value of Judaism, but its putative or theoretical effect upon the outside world. Now, the outside world paid no attention at all. And although we argued mightily about Judaism all the way from Jewish Christian Science down to the, or up to the Agudas Yisrael, with all the various shadings, to the outside world, to whom it was intended to appeal, every one of them was simply a damn Jew and nothing else, whatever the variation. So that it is quite irrelevant to speak of these varieties of Judaism. Oh, so what's happening here? I've got a complete bridge hand. What? Without a finesse. Well, I'm not going to attempt to answer all these. I'm very much interested in hearing what Dr. Kaplan has to say. I want a busman's holiday. So that, as I say, an American Reformed Judaism gave little, and in any case, we must get away from all these distinctions in a new examination of Judaism where, if there are differences, and there will be differences, they will be based upon a totally new concept of what Judaism is. I'm asked, is American Judaism going to be reconstructed without any connection to Israel? No, I don't think it was implied by either of us that is the case. And as a matter of fact, as I argued in my first two lectures, the reconstruction, the recreation of Israel was the effort of world Jewry to adapt itself to the new world, to have a center where Judaism could be freed from the pressures, the cajoleries, and the irradiations of the outside world to whatever extent it can be, so that there at least you have the maximum opportunity for Jewish development. Now, this is an extremely interesting question. Mr. Samuel, what was the first good joke that you pulled? I seem to have forgotten it. Now, it's bad enough that my jokes are repeated away from my meetings without credits, that I should actually supply a man a second time with the information.
He wants enjoyment. You see, he asks for the program.
He wants enjoyment? He got his enjoyment. He's not entitled to more. Somebody wants information about the lyre, L-Y-R-E, that I am not in a position to give. The lyre and David's harp, I'm afraid that's a little bit too specialized for me. Kindly give some concrete examples of the traditions that you think should be changed and what the changes should be. I can't do that because I am actually not interested in individual traditions. I'm not interested, as a matter of fact, in rejecting any traditions or in changing traditions. I am interested in helping to create so passionate an interest in Jewish things and so deep and continuous a preoccupation with Jewish books, and of course, first of all, with the Bible, with Jewish history, with Jewish intellectual endeavor. I am so interested in steeping people in these things to such an extent that out of this interest there will spring traditions. But you don't actually change traditions consciously and programmatically. There's a story told of some men who founded a university. They could do it, they were very rich. Then they held a meeting and they sat down and said, gentlemen, now let us found a tradition, and found that they couldn't. Now, one doesn't found a tradition in that way, but one can predispose people to the founding of a tradition. And that is what most of my life work has been devoted to. What is the methodology of intellectual preparation for Jewish life in America? Don't you think that some emotional basis, as embodied in tradition, is required to strengthen the edifice? Do you propose to create new traditions? Now, this is a very searching question from several points of view. Methodology, I haven't got one. I just haven't got one. I only know that I found certain things in Jewishness terrifically interesting. So much so that I threw myself into them heart and soul. I found that Yiddish was a highly instructive and edifying episode in Jewish civilization. So I went into it and I read Yiddish literature and I began to write about Jewish writers. I found that Hebrew, and I had to learn these languages as a grown-up, I found that Hebrew was essential to a glimpse of the inner life of the Jew. So I went in for it. My Hebrew will never be as good as my Yiddish, but it is enough for reading and enjoyment purposes. I can't lecture in Hebrew as I do in Yiddish. I found that Jewish history was enormously instructive from many points of view. I went in for these things. Now, naturally, I am a professional learner because I'm a professional teacher. I'm in the happy position of making a living out of the things that I would do if I didn't have to make a living out of them anyway. And I can't expect other people to plunge into these. But believe me, intellectual enjoyment is not the prerogative of the professional Jew. It's everybody's prerogative. So that I would say to a person who asks me, what is the methodology of intellectual preparation? Find something that interests you and go after it like mad. That's all I can say. You'll find all sorts of people ready to help you, but be sure that it's interesting. Don't subject yourself to the discipline of the supreme nudnik, who, as some of you know, finishes up as a fudnik. You know what a fudnik is, I suppose? A nudnik with a PhD. Finishes up with an immense knowledge of a number of things in which nobody is interested, and not even himself. When you say, don't you think that some emotional basis as embodied in tradition is required, that is a very subtle and a very important and very difficult question. And I don't know how to answer it. I know that I found in my intellectual pursuit of these things, in Shalom Aleichem and Peretz and Mendele, in the earlier writers in Hasidism, in Jewish history, I found an emotional response. I found an emotional response in the history of the Jewish people as a narrative. And it wasn't, let me tell you, in the glorification of the warrior and the standing up of the Maccabees, or even the martyrology of the 10 martyrs in the time. I'm not terribly impressed by martyrs. I'm not terribly impressed by physical heroes. Probably for the reason I don't intend to be a martyr, and I couldn't be a hero. But that has very little to do with it. I think that martyrs and heroes happen to be people with special psychological quirks. Sollen sie mir Meuchel sein, sollen sie haben mal lichtigen Gan Eden. But one has to have a special kind of fixation for that sort of thing. There are other finer, I think, more delicate and tender things in which Jewish history, experience, and biography abounds that supply some of this emotional drive. Then, of course, there is the emotional association with people. There is also some of the emotional association with your kin. It is permissible to some extent. It is not a deadly sin to be fond of your family. Of course, if you overdo it, it becomes primitive. It becomes the clan. But it's better to like the people who are near you than to pretend to like all the world and thus escape from having to like anybody in particular. There is a certain proper emotional foundation for these relationships. But I must confess, I can't answer that question as it deserves to be. And actually, it is something that I'll have to think a great deal about, and I have to thank the questioner for this provocation. Do you propose to create new traditions? I've dealt with that, and I won't return to it. I'll take another 5 minutes, Dr. Kaplan, and then To what extent do you consider the synagogue or temple as at present constituted can contribute to the growth of the interpretation you have outlined? Well, this question really doesn't mean very much. The synagogue or temple is a vessel. Depends upon the rabbi, depends upon what is taught there, it depends upon the persons. I go very little to synagogue. And I go very little to synagogue because, quite frankly, I get bored by most of the services. When there is a rabbi who is a thinker, when there is an atmosphere in which I can get a response, I go. Now, don't dismiss that saying, well, that's your perfect right. I'm not sure that it is my right not to go. Maybe one ought to go even if one is bored. I remember that when the poet Bialik was in this country, and they pushed him around from place to place and made him speak at hundreds of meetings till the man was on the point of collapse. But he went like a good soldier, and finally I said to him, how do you keep it up, for God's sake? He said, listen, do you think that our fathers, when they davened every morning, liked it? Don't you think they were bored sometimes? He says, well, this, he says, I do a substitute of my father's davening, which I don't practice. Now, there may be something in that. On the other hand, I am alarmed by the prospect of the blasphemy which is contained in being bored in a synagogue. It is a form of blasphemy. So I can't answer this question again. Perhaps Dr. Kaplan would care to take it up. Now, I think that I've answered about as many questions as I can without... Oh, yes, there's one here. Perhaps the play motif in our American life is a release from competition by its transformation into non-brutal activity. The old Jew who decried it may simply have been too inhibited to enjoy himself. Those Jews were not too inhibited to enjoy themselves. Don't make a mistake. Don't imagine that that old Jewish life was ascetic and dour like that of the Scotch Covenanters. It was nothing of the sort. There was merriment, there was gaiety, there was enjoyment, there was even sex. There was a whole lot of life there. There was a whole lot of life there in which a good deal of physical, aesthetic, and animal enjoyment entered. But I don't believe in this business of a release from competition by transformation. The word that's generally used is sublimation. It isn't true. There is, as a matter of fact, too much competition in our lives anyhow, that we should need additional practice in these purely fictitious and factitious games. That in addition to competing in business, and competing socially, and competing in the synagogue, and competing in the universities, we actually go out and we organize gratis. We organize gratuitous forms of competition, schlag door kop in de wand, just for competition. I don't believe that is necessary at all. Well, I think I'll vacate the field to Dr. Kaplan.
Mr. Samuel may not have given you a detailed program dealing with the way to enjoy Jewish life. I don't think he had to do it. All he had to do was to talk, and he himself illustrated what it meant to enjoy Jewish life. If we had that approach to Jewish life and that kind of interpretation, I think our program for a future would be quite complete. The following are some of the questions that have been put to me. Isn't Judaism based on a concept of the principle of a God? Of course, our heritage is inseparable from the idea of God. But the idea of God itself is subject to interpretation and reinterpretation. And as a matter of fact, unless we succeed in having the God idea function for Jewish life in a manner analogous to the way in which it functioned in the past, I doubt whether with all that we are going to do for it in the way of organization or in the way of creating Jewish values, we will succeed in perpetuating it. And I'm very much concerned with the perpetuation of Jewish life. Jewish life will have to make good its promise of helping mankind adjust itself to life and finding meaning in the world. That has been the distinctive trait of our heritage. and in a way has constituted a motive for perpetuating it. It has had that inherent power, and it must recapture it. And the way to recapture it is no longer the way in which it was captured in the past. It was captured in the past by a kind of acceptance of the authority of highly inspired individual men. Now, the idea of God must come to be significant to all and sundry in such a way as to be intelligible to them, so that it would not have to be accepted on the authority of anybody's say-so. This is one of the tremendous differences between the age in which we live and the ages which our ancestors lived. They were satisfied to live by the authority of those whom they looked up to as somehow superhuman. The average human being is not willing to recognize now that any other human being possesses superhuman qualities. The average person, intellectually, if not physically, comes from Missouri. And he wants to understand why he should believe what he is asked to believe. It will therefore be essential for those of us who are interested in perpetuating Jewish life to make the idea of God function in our lives in the same way as we expect the idea of democracy to function in our lives if we are to be loyal to what is best in American civilization. And it may well be that as American Jews, we may find the roots of that democracy in the God idea as understood by our ancestors. Just let me give you a simple illustration of what I mean. You take at the present time, there are three great requirements which must be met if there is to be an orderly and peaceful world. Namely, security and justice and freedom. Security alone without justice and freedom gives us Sovietism. Freedom without justice gives us a competitive social order in which the depressed classes remain depressed and are exploited. And justice without security and without freedom is inconceivable. Now, the Jewish idea of God, which is stressed in its three great festivals, and Jewish festivals are intended primarily from the traditional point of view to be not only a source of joy, which gives them their folk character, v'samachta b'chagecha, but also to be at the same time a means of bringing to the fore, of putting the limelight on the idea of God. And you have in our three great festivals the emphasis upon freedom on the Passover, upon justice and the idea of Shavuot, the handing down of the Torah, and security based on equality in our Sukkot festival. There's no reason in the world why these three aspects of the idea of God cannot be the source of music, of poetry, of all that we call creative values, and thereby help to give to these festivals not only a highly intellectual but a very strong emotional character and folk aspect. There's very much work to be done, particularly by stressing the need for reinterpreting the idea of God. There are two more questions on the same, but I'll try to answer a question of one of the following cards. The Bible constantly talks of Kol Israel. This means that all Israel at the proper time will become one. Those in the diaspora, that in Galut, and those in Israel. Eretz Israel for Kol Israel. As Mr. Samuel well emphasized, the point on which we both definitely agree is the centrality of the Jews in Israel. It is there that Jewish life has the chance of developing normally, of influencing every aspect of Jewish life, and is an indispensable source of Jewish life throughout the rest of the world. Or to change the metaphor, it is the hub without which the spokes, that is the juries or the Jewish communities in other lands, cannot be held together.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.